So again, the first sort of myth versus fact I want to talk about is, Linda, you and I talked about this, so I'll start with you. A lot of the rhetoric, a lot of the people that are for the president's policies, is one of the arguments is that the asylum seekers are here to game the system. That I mean, asylum is difficult to achieve anyway. Correct? It doesn't matter the administration. So just tell us a little bit about I guess if you could talk about what you're seeing the most and how you sort of fight back and dispel the myth that these folks are coming over to take our resources, to take our jobs, that they're not really fleeing violent countries. I think a former Attorney General said that, we're sorry that Central America can't get its act together, but just violence alone isn't a basis for fleeing your country and coming here. So what are you seeing on the ground with respect to the folks that do make it here?
So the violence that people are fleeing is absolutely real. There is no doubt about it. We have been working in Ciudad Juarez due to the Remain in Mexico, the forcing asylum seekers to wait in Mexico in a country they're not from, in a country they don't know, in a country that they don't have any connections to for their court dates and for the processing of their entire asylum case. Of the people that we have seen, over 80% are reporting fleeing violence from their home country. So when I've sat with the men, the women, the families, the children, and we've spoken to them about what they're fleeing, it's absolutely real. It's just, it's false to think that the majority of these people are not fleeing violence, and that it's not, let's decide to go to the United States because the United States has Disneyland. It is, we have no other choice but to leave because we're in hiding, and we can only be in hiding for so long before either, many times it is the gangs. And also to see people returned in the years that we've been doing this, and the fear that they live in, or oftentimes also losing their lives if they've lost an asylum case and the judges are sending them back.
But when they are given whatever permission it is to be in this country, how do they contribute to society once they're here? Are they able to work? Are they able to sort of contribute? Or are they just kind of laying low to wait for their adjudication? I mean, how active are they once they get to the United States?
So it's very difficult to talk about asylum right now because asylum doesn't exist anymore under this current administration that has completely gutted asylum. Asylum, for anybody who, we know that there's a transit ban, meaning anyone who has traveled through an additional country before getting into the United States after July 16th is not eligible for asylum. They're eligible for a lower, a less protective relief, which is called withholding. This places people, it places them makes them extremely vulnerable. But let me tell you about what happens when somebody does gain asylum, because despite that, despite how difficult it is to gain asylum in El Paso, the Las Americas team has really done an excellent job at winning asylum cases. And so I'm just going to tell you just a couple of personal stories. I have some of these people on my Facebook page. So this is what's real. A gay couple from El Salvador who was being threatened. The gang members were at their house. They were yelling gay slurs at them and threatening to kill them. They had guns in their hands. They call the police and they say, they're trying to hurt my partner and I. And he goes, your partner, like a guy? And he says, yes, me and my partner. And they say, we don't help people like you. And the police hung up the phone. We were able to achieve asylum for both of these young men. They're still together, they're living in California, and they work hard every single day. They are now contributing to this economy in such amazing ways. To see them traveling, to see them working, to see them building community. And to me, the pinnacle of this is why I became an immigration attorney, to see them at the Gay Pride Parade in Los Angeles, living their true selves. That is what asylum is. And that is what this current administration is gutting because of these false narratives and these myths. So,
okay, thank you. Ali, I mentioned your emails in the morning. I think it was if not yesterday, day before yesterday. I think there was a Forbes article on how more people are going to Canada. The United States is seeing fewer and fewer immigrants joining the workforce. And just this morning, the Washington Post had a story. The president's chief of staff, Mick Mulvaney, was apparently it was at an event in England. He said, we need more immigrants. We need, of course, he says we need more of a legal workforce. But how dramatic is the problem with all these restrictions on immigration? I mean, what are we in store for if we don't, up our workforce and we keep with these sort of prohibitive policies?
Well, I mean, first of all, let me touch on the Mulvaney story.
Sure.
So, like Julián said, this morning there was a Washington Post story that Mick Mulvaney, and a little bit about Mick Mulvaney. When he was a member of the House of Representatives, he was a leading conservative Republican Freedom Caucus member. But what many people don't realize is that Mick Mulvaney in 2013, maybe 2014, we helped organize an event with him in his district with Hispanic evangelical pastors, and the New York Times was there. And he said in that meeting that he believed that we needed to reform our immigration system. So Mick Mulvaney is not your kind of standard conservative Republican that you see today. He gets this stuff. So for him to say that in a private meeting where I don't think he realized he was being recorded is wonderful. So, but two things. One is that I would bet pretty good money that Stephen Miller canceled his honeymoon is on the way back to the White House to make sure nothing happens. Second is that if Mick Mulvaney is going to say this stuff privately, it actually doesn't count. He is the chief of staff to the President of the United States. If he believes this, if he cares about it, he actually has to have this debate with the Stephen Miller faction of the White House and make the case to the president that there is a different way that's necessary for immigrants and immigration to the U.S. So yes, this is going to be a bit of a buzz in D.C. for a little while until the next story, right? But I think Mick Mulvaney and other conservatives realize that, and I think it was Mr. Hunt who was talking about earlier today about the economic need for immigrants and immigration. Whether it's the healthcare industry or construction, construction here in Texas has a massive shortage of workers. So when you add up and you look across the cuts to legal immigration by this administration, whether it's refugee numbers, difficulty around H-1Bs, difficulty around H-2s, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, you see, we're going to start to see a pretty significant decline in the number of legal immigrants able to come to the U.S. And that will, when you combine it with a declining fertility rate within the U.S., we're going to run out of workers. And that is no longer a problem that is 2-3 decades away. That is a problem that is less than a decade away. We did some research in 2015 that said that by 2020, like this year, we're going to see a private sector worker shortage of about 7 million. Those numbers are already coming to bear.
So you said within the next 10 years, if these policies continue, then we're going to be in some trouble.
I think we're already in this trouble now.
Okay.
Now.
Okay. And Mr. Esparza, again, thank you for being here. We know you're very busy, but again, one of the arguments, to restrict immigration is that folks come here and they commit crimes at a higher rate. So in your experience, as the chief prosecutor in El Paso County, is that true? I mean, do the folks who are here as immigrants, whether they have authorization or not, do they commit crimes? Are they more of a problem than U.S. citizens or permanent or legal residents?
I'm going to tell you something that all these El Pasoans know. We have always been proud of the fact that we are one of the safest cities for our size. I think in 1995, since 1995, we've been in the top 10 of safest cities. And since something like 2004, we've been in the top 5. So we are a safe city. The marriage between us and Mexico, it works. I don't see, since 1995, our average, our crime rate continues to drop. I've been asked the question whether, why do we have such low crime here? I would love to tell you it's because of the DA, but I only say that during elections. I honestly think it's the community and it's the culture. And we live in this environment, and I hear that all the time, and I can just categorically tell you that it is not true.
Do you know how it affects the border outside of El Paso? For example, District Attorney Alaniz in Webb County. I mean, he's made similar comments, but he's not as forceful about it because, I mean, does it change, in different parts of the border, or do you know as a whole that, everybody's on the same page?
One of the things I do besides my DA job, I'm the project director for a unit we call the Border Prosecution Unit, which is a unit that the state funds. Mm-hmm. So I just came back from a meeting with border prosecutors. That's 17 of us from here to Brownsville, and all the lawyers and staff that the state has allowed us to hire. And we don't see, I guarantee you, my colleagues would tell you the very same thing. It is a different type of crime, though, in the Rio Grande Valley. They don't have the same safety numbers that we have, but it's going to be related to drugs or something along those lines. It's not particular to a population, right? And I think it's the geography. If you just look at our geography, we live in the Chihuahuan Desert, so you have to either navigate the mountain or you got to navigate the desert. And then you got to navigate the 20 miles really between us and there. So if you're really coming in, you got to come around the edges. That's very hard terrain. So that makes it difficult. But if you go to the Rio Grande Valley, they don't have that same issue regarding the terrain. Okay. But I'm confident to say I've talked to my colleagues up and down the river pretty often, and there wouldn't be a single one of them that I believe would attribute their crime rate due to immigration.
And Ms. Yellen, similar sort of theme, I guess, here is, again, the healthcare argument, right, is that folks that are in the country as immigrants, whether it's authorized or not, that, they take resources from folks, and in the healthcare debate, that's one of the main criticism. Can you tell us, what the folks that you serve, is there a difference? I mean, is there any truth to the argument that that's why we need to restrict immigration because you're taking away resources from folks at large?
Yeah, well, I mean, no. So fundamentally, I mean, I believe that healthcare is a right, and I also believe that immigrants to our country contribute more than they take, and that's true of most of the workers in our country and people who are here. The challenge for our communities is how do we provide the kind of care that people need. And so if we're looking at immigrants and asylum seekers, our community was so extraordinary over the last year, always been, with hospitality centers. And when we had a flood of migrants and asylum seekers to our community, everyone, Maslow's hierarchy, food, shelter, and our physician community stepped up and said, okay, let's provide medical care. What can we do? And then also our hospital systems generously took and are required by law, but provided a lot of basic health care to the population that needed that support, and without immunization records, medical histories, and all of those things. One of the big policy challenges in our country is that these burdens fall to the generosity of local communities and then the tax base of those communities. And we know that people talked about 20%, 5% of our population being uninsured. In addition, we have either undocumented families that will struggle to access, are living in our country and working and contributing, that struggle to access care and have to rely on the safety net system. And then we have many hardworking people who are underemployed or fully employed, also without access to care because our state has not adopted Medicaid expansion, because the health changes in healthcare law and policy don't offer the funding that we need to fully support our community.
And I want to ask you the same question that I asked the panel that I was on earlier with respect to some legislation or some policies with respect to public charge, folks showing up. Or have you seen a decline in the people that are seeking access because they're afraid now that some of these policies are out there?
Yeah, I mean, we're very worried about this. So you see, if you are a family, for public charge, you still qualify for Medicaid and children's health insurance. So, but families are fearful of repercussions with the new public charge. It's confusing. It's not clear. And in Texas, we make it very hard for people to roll or re-enroll in programs that they're eligible to receive. And so we're absolutely seeing a decline in enrollment in those entitlement programs. And then, of course, we talked about the census earlier. That's going to be another issue. We're certainly afraid that our community will be very undercounted because of issues around public charge.
Okay, thank you. Linda, back to you. In the green room, we were talking about, you mentioned it, actually, and I wanted you kind of to elaborate on what we were saying. You said that had it not been for the amnesty, for lack of a better term, under the Reagan administration, that the makeup of El Paso and the border at large would be really, really different. What exactly, I mean, how different would it be if there was never this amnesty under the Reagan administration in 1980, was it 86?
In the late 80s.
In the late 80s, okay, yeah.
So something that we see at Las Americas is around the time of the current administration's campaigning, there was a lot of people who wanted to become citizens. They just hadn't done it. They were scared. Some of them were waiting for exemptions because there is an English language requirement unless you're over a certain age and you've been here for a certain amount of time. So at Las Americas, we really started to see a huge increase in folks wanting to become United States citizens. And that's one of the services that we provide. I started to notice a pattern. I noticed a pattern, you ask, how did you become a resident? And so these people from the ages ranging of 65 to, their mid, late 80s, they became residents, a lot of them, during amnesty. That was by Reagan. And you start to look at their file, right? They're these beautiful human beings in front of you, but they have a lot of pieces of paper. And you're going through it, and you see that, some of them have been working at EPISD, from the time that they're lawfully able to work, and they've contributed to, different sectors for 20, 30 years. Their children have grown up here. Their children are investing in El Paso and coming back to El Paso after they receive their education. Some of their children are in the military. And what I think of is, what's going to happen now? Because this is El Paso. Many of the folks that were regularized their status via amnesty. And what happens now to the families who are too scared to get their health benefits for their USC children because they themselves could be deported, or they could be completely left out of the ability to legalize their own status, and this fear rhetoric of people not being able to come forward, and family separation that we've been seeing on the border for many years. And I'm not talking about zero tolerance. I'm talking about family separation via deportation that happens every single day, not only on our borders, but all across the nation. And for me, we really have to think that something has to be done, because El Paso would not be what El Paso is today if it had not been for amnesty. And so many of us out there are abuelos and our abuelas that were regularized thanks to that.
Ali, I know Evan talked about this last time, but I wanted to talk to you about DACA. I mean, there's a good chance that the program could be done away with. I guess two questions. Just I think there's an obvious answer, but you could probably define it a little bit better. What is that going to do to the economy and the future workforce? And then second, you're in D.C. Do you read the tea leaves, and is there going to be anything that's going to be done legislatively to protect these folks?
Sure. So Evan earlier had cited some fact sheets that were put out by, our study was done by Forward.us, and I think that it was about 100,000 DACA recipients here in the state, generating about $1 billion in GDP annually. So I mean, the number is significant, whether you're talking about actual human beings, which is the most important part, but also their contributions to the local economy. So this is what could happen. So late last year, there was a hearing at the Supreme Court around the case that started here in South Texas, or in South Texas, out of Judge Haynen's court. And in essence, the question on the table is whether or not the administration rescinded deferred action for childhood arrivals, DACA, correctly, whether or not they went through the right process.
This was the public comment period?
Whether it was a public comment period or I think they had just kind of made the decision as opposed to going through kind of a set of rule changing processes. So there's a bunch of nitty gritty behind this. But at the end of the day, the Supreme Court they're going to make this decision. So I think what will happen is that the Supreme Court will say, yes, the administration made this decision the correct way. That's the worst case scenario. And what that happens then is, then the next question is, okay, how does the program end? The program could end or it could be phased out. The administration could say, okay, over time, we will no longer take renewals. Or they could say, we will stop taking renewals today. Or in the most extreme version, they could retroactively pull status. I don't think that last version is possible or is realistic. I think what will happen is that the court will decide, and then the administration will say, okay, the program ends, we will no longer take renewals. So point number one, if you know somebody who's eligible for renewal, DACA renewal, encourage them to take advantage of that renewal immediately. That's the most important thing that they can do. On the Hill in Congress, you've got a couple of different vehicles moving. In the House, you have a clean, if you will, DREAM Act, in essence legalization for the undocumented young people, that is, I believe, moved through the House. You also have an agricultural worker bill that moved through the House late last year on a bipartisan basis. You had Republicans and Democrats sitting down, hashing out this legislation, in essence in secret, and then getting a bipartisan vote. My point here is that if the Supreme Court says, yes, you can rescind the program, the administration says, we're not going to take renewals, we go into the spring and summer of this year with a legislative flashpoint that provides an opening. And that opening is that the Senate could move forward on a solution for DACA recipients and or the farm worker community. Chances of that happening, I think, really rest with the White House, and whether or not the White House is going to be content with a simple and narrow solution, or they're going to continue to try to reduce and slash legal immigration and, frankly, make life here on the border more and more and more enforcement-centric.
Okay. Mr. Esparza, how does your office deal with folks that don't have authorization? There's been a lot of talk about sanctuary cities, and which I know that the overall generic term is deals with county jails that don't turn folks over to ICE that have a flag. But how does your office, in just the day-to-day operations, deal with folks that aren't in the country legally?
It's kind of a tricky question because there's several groups. First, we have victims who are not in the country legally and are afraid to come forward. We have that group.
Okay.
Then we have those who have committed a crime and now their immigration status is possibly in question, and they have lawyers. And so we spend our time with those victims who are in the country illegally and then are applying for a U visa. So we go back and forth. It's evolved over time. I like to think that now we are much more liberal with how we do this. For instance, when we look at those who applied for a U visa as a result of the Walmart shooting, there were about 38, 40 of them. Some have been accepted. There's some pending, but we have, I think, a category. I've spoken to at least 2 or 3, maybe all 5 of them, and they are outside the statutory range. They're too old.
Okay.
So in that case, what we're going to do, every one of these people has really compelling story. They're just really compelling story. And so we are trying to work with, it's either Las Americas or whoever is representing them. And what we're planning to do is move the application along with a letter. And maybe that will get the application moving. But, if you talk to they're outside the law. You could just, I think, Las Americas may have a different opinion, but I think that we could probably just deny it. And that's what the statute says. But we're in their case, we're gonna see if we can move it along. You got to get through us first, so we're gonna move it along and see how it goes. But the U visa, I actually don't have those many cases. I probably maybe handle 100 in a year, so it's not those many. What really I find troubling to me is when we do a lot of work on domestic violence, and I always get the batterer to tell the defense lawyer to tell us that she's only complaining because she wants her U visa. I can tell you that's also not true. That's just not true. And so, but that's what we do. We work with agencies like Las Americas, and we work on the U visa.
So the shooting was more than 6 months ago. When did these folks apply for this protection, and is that an average length of time for a U visa for anybody that applies with a legitimate case?
I'm probably not the right one to answer that question. I will tell you that They got their applications in pretty quickly, but I think they got them in quickly because there were lots of services available to them. And so they had a lot of advice. My standard victim, the victim of crime, I think it takes them a while to somebody to tell them, hey, you could get a U visa. Have you ever thought of applying for a U visa? A U visa will help you stay in the country, and while the while the case is pending, you might even be able to change your status and improve it. I think a lot of in the community aren't aware of that, and so those applications usually take a while. Plus, the application can take some time if the case takes some time. But the Walmart is special only because I think those victims have in that tragedy, have the benefit of having services sooner than later.
Have healthcare providers seen an increase, I guess, in sort of a psychological effect after the shooting? And if you could speak to that, what are you guys hearing with respect? I mean, do people feel targeted still, or is it just is it PTSD? I mean, for lack of a better term, I don't mean to be disrespectful using that, but I mean, you'd be the person to.
So we were one of 2 foundations that helped receive contributions in the wake of the tragedy, and created with the City of El Paso One Fund El Paso, which took this amazing generosity and goodwill to provide direct support to victims and families. And there was a very public process for feedback on that criteria. And so our communities, we've raised a little over $11.8 million. And victims and families would be eligible for the philanthropy for if they were killed, had a family member killed, if they were physically injured. And we had this really wonderful task force, including the district attorney's office and mental health providers, the city and the county, that included psychological trauma, because we really recognized that there will be, immediate and ongoing trauma in our community, not only just for families, people who were there, and so that this goodwill is been made available to them, but on an ongoing basis. So our community, the United Way, working with the County of El Paso, has a resiliency center. There's some funding for ongoing mental health services. Emergence Health Network also has availability of mental health services. And then we awarded, as a health foundation, 2 kind of emergency grants. One was to the El Paso Child Guidance Center for their trauma-informed care. And then the second was to Texas Tech because of House Bill 10 and the ability to expand the child's psychiatry access network. So to be able to, Texas Tech is now eligible for almost $5 million to increase the availability to services to children and families. And this is going to, we are so underserved. We need a whole panel in session. We need like a whole day on healthcare so we can cover this appropriately. But the providers, and particularly in psychology and in psychiatry and counseling, there's a severe shortage that Texas has recognized, and our community is working very hard to address. So, there'll be psychological trauma for people who were there, for our children who saw it on Instagram as they were watching it that day, for every kid that has, I have a high schooler that had a lockdown. We're going to have these repeated feelings of trauma in our community, and it's going to take, we're going to have a trial that will be a constant reminder of what's happening, and the fact that we're also dealing with issues of gun violence and hatred and racism. That it's so complex, but I'm very proud of our community's response, and I know we're going to work together to heal. It'll take a while.
You didn't ask me this, but when I think about the Walmart shooting, so any community would have been shocked to have that kind of crime committed. 22 dead, 26 injured. All the people in the Walmart who fled because they were fearful for their lives. So that part isn't unique, but it is a good snapshot of El Paso. If you take it so this happened at 10:38 on that Saturday morning, August 3rd. So just take it back a minute to 10:37. And that is really us. That Walmart is one of the busiest in the country. And the mix in that community, right? There were some of the 22 that were killed were from Mexico. There were, and then the rest were either El Pasoans or someone who was visiting us. But that is a great snapshot of us on what was a beautiful Saturday morning, and us transacting business there. There was people out in front trying to raise some money, and it wasn't an El Pasoan who brought all that damage to us. It was an outsider, right? We are in. You know, when I go to Austin, sometimes I wonder if they remember us because we're so far away. But in our little area, right, in our little colony over here where we're at, that Saturday morning was a beautiful day, and we were transacting business. We were talking to each other in friendly ways that we do every Saturday. And if it had not been for an outsider, we would have had a beautiful Saturday.
With respect to a timeline on the prosecution, the U.S. Attorney's Office announced just 2-3 weeks ago that they obviously brought an indictment in the grand jury, and he's being charged with several federal crimes as well. And the U.S. Attorney for the Western District of Texas said that there'll be parallel prosecutions. How does that work? Is there any chance the feds are going to take over the prosecution? Fill us in.
Well, my hope is that Texas prosecutors take care of this. This is a crime that I've thought a lot about this. This is a crime that occurred in El Paso, and I think this community should deal with how we hold the shooter accountable. And so this really should be a state case. But we are working parallel with the feds. The feds have a national interest as well. I think what you'll see is, so we indicted in October for capital murder, and we're seeking the death penalty. So those cases are now they're going to move parallel. And I think whatever case gets going, right now our case is just kind of sitting. We are seeking the death penalty, so there's got to be some time to prepare, and so I understand that part. But we're not really moving. And then I think it gets a little complicated since I only have 11 months in office.
Sure.
And so, we'll see how that works out, how the handoff occurs. And I think it depends on what the feds do in regards to moving their case in the federal system. It's a little early to tell, but I think it's North Carolina. What was his name? Ruth? The shooting in the church. The feds eventually prosecuted that case, and my opinion of one of the reasons they stepped in was the state case just faltered. It wasn't moving. And so I think, they have, the federal government has the same goal. I think they haven't officially said they'll seek the death penalty, but my guess is sometime in May or June, they have a different process than I have. They will seek the death penalty, and then we'll see which one gets moving.
How much is the process, if it stays with the state, how much is it going to cost the county to prosecute? There's been reports anywhere from $6 to $8 million. Why not just hand it off to the feds and save the taxpayers that money? I know it's not that
Okay,
easy,
I know you
but
asked me that question, but let me just tell you, I find it offensive. All right? I'm not going to put a dollar amount on the type of hurt and damage and tragedy that he caused here.
Okay.
This is a crime that occurred here. And so I don't think in our community we are going to hold you accountable. And I have other cases which are, that cost the community as well. But if you're going to take 22 lives from us, plus the 26 that you injured, and all of the people you've hurt, I think El Paso is up to the task. And certainly, funding should never be a barrier in this prosecution. So I can tell you, I'm not going to hand it off to the feds just because it's cheaper.
Okay.
All right? Here in El Paso, we're going to hold them accountable.
And last on the prosecution, with respect to the Mexican government was very adamant that they wanted to be, involved in the process, or at least in communication with the folks here on this side. Are you at liberty to say what your conversations have been with the Mexican officials?
We have a really good relationship with the Mexican consulate. We have regular conversations. They have asked some specific questions. I've tried to answer those for them, but I think that we will partner with them. One of the things that we do really well is our relationship now with the victims, either the families, the surviving families, or those that are hurt. And so we stay in touch with them, and we stay in touch with the families that are in Juarez. About a week ago, I spent about 5 days talking to each family just to let them know what was going on, and I was pretty certain the feds were about to indict, and I didn't want them to be confused.
Okay.
I didn't want them to think that the feds took the case, but I also didn't want them to get the impression that that we were in conflict with each other. We share our evidence back and forth. We talk. They don't need our prosecutorial assistance, different law, different evidence kind of thing, but we work together. And on August 3rd, when this happened, there were not just local law enforcement there. You know, the feds showed up as well, and so we've collected the evidence, and we'll proceed. I think we're going to proceed in a pretty smart way. It's just a matter of can the case get moving?
Okay. Excuse me, Linda, back to you. We were talking about the Refugee Resettlement Program, which is it's a different program than what we're seeing. You know, the folks from New Mexico. You know, Governor Abbott made headlines by being the first governor to not opt into the program, and his office was correct in saying that doesn't mean that people couldn't resettle in, you know, Louisiana or wherever, and then eventually move to Texas. Obviously, the folks that wanted the governor to opt into the program said, well, that's just another layer of time that they're going to be separated from folks if they already have family in Texas. Can you? How big a deal is this? Because, you know, the folks that were in support of what the governor did by not opting in were saying, look, this is a small number compared to the amount of immigrants that the United States takes in every year anyway. And Texas, I think, Texas was, the last few years, a leader in refugee resettlement. So explain, you know, is this, it's a big deal politically, but with respect to how it's going to affect population, explain, you know, the refugee resettlement program and how that looks for the demographics with the governor deciding not to opt into this.
Well, I mean, obviously, I think that the sentiment from us as an advocacy agency, it was very shameful to see this coming from Texas, who had been, you know, in the lead of taking people who, these are folks that are vetted outside of the country. They're going through you know, being categorized as refugees. Refugee is a legal term that happens. This happens outside of the country, and so we see this. It seems to be convoluted with, you know, what's happening on the border and kind of this narrative of security and scarcity and kind of what feeds into the fear of the border. And I think that it starts to get really convoluted, especially what the public even thinks that what we're doing by not allowing refugees in. And it's very, very disheartening because, again, these are, I mean, both are asylum seekers that are coming from Latin American countries that don't necessarily have access to the refugee programs. It looks very, very different. You know, they're not applying from outside, they're fleeing and they're coming and they're what we call it, knocking at the door. Refugees, some folks differently, and will live their whole lives in a refugee camp because they're just waiting for their number to come up, to be able to be resettled, to be able to make their lives again. So again, as we're shutting down these avenues, we're shutting down avenues to seeking asylum, we're shutting down avenues for refugees to be able to safely and legally resettle in the United States. It continues to go against, you know, the values of us being an immigrant community, an immigrant country.
Ali, was anybody shocked when Texas, you know, made news in this way up in D.C. and, you know, the other organizations you work with?
Yeah, so a lot of our strategy as an organization is to work with conservative and moderate faith law enforcement and business leaders. And we had been working with evangelical pastors across the country and they had been organizing to send letters to, you know, Governor Lee in Tennessee, a number of other Republican governors, including Abbott. And, you know, I remember kind of going back and forth with one of the national leaders in the evangelical community. And, you know, I think at that point it was, you know, Abbott here in Texas, DeSantis in Florida, and then the governor of Georgia were kind of the three big Republican governors left to kind of make a decision. And, you know, he told me that he would not be surprised if Abbott decided to in essence, do what he did. Right. And I think that like Linda was saying, the numbers are not significant, but the message is profound. So if you are an immigrant or a refugee or a CEO or a pastor or a police chief or a sheriff who is recruiting immigrants and refugees to work or serve or be a part of your church, how can you make a legitimate case to that individual and say, the state of Texas loves you, right? That's the message that Governor Abbott is sending. And so I think that his decision, you know, when John Cornyn publicly says that he has concerns with Abbott's decision, that's really significant. I mean, Senator Cornyn does not, He doesn't say something without meaning it. Right? He is very, very calculated with his words. So I thought that was pretty interesting. And, you know, I also, just to kind of a little diversion, if you don't mind, because sometimes these immigration conversations can get a little depressing. Right? So I want to just take a hot second and give you a reason why I really, really admire and respect El Paso.
Sure.
You know, not just, I say this, I don't say this everywhere. You know, because El Paso, I don't think the country understands this community, whether it's on this side of the border, or on the other side of the border, or the entirety of the region. And that is something that's absolutely remarkable. And, you know, when you have leadership like at UTEP, like at Las Americas, like at Hope Border Institute, at Ciudad Nueva, and all these other organizations that we've been fortunate enough to come to know, in DC, where it's really hard to see kind of a glimmer of hope of, okay, how are things going to get better? It's a place like El Paso that gives us hope, and all the organizations and all of you. So thank you.
All right, well, thank you for that, sir. We appreciate it. Folks, if anybody has a question, you can go ahead and start lining up if you'd like to. And just one last thing, I want to go back to the DACA. One of the industries that could be affected more as far as professionals and people that are educated into these fields is the medical field, is the healthcare industry. I mean, is that explain? Do you have any concerns if DACA is done away with respect to just getting talent and qualified people in these positions?
Yeah, I mean, it's already a challenge in our community, helping healthcare professionals at all levels with their immigration status and ability to work in our community. So anything that you would, that the government might do to take that ability away hurts our community. I also, a couple of colleagues here sit on the Federal Reserve Board, El Paso branch with Dr. Sarata, and Julio Chu is here earlier. And I mean, we hear over and over the need to increase immigration in our country, really also because of workforce shortages. And I'm worried not just about workforce and healthcare, but our healthcare community has really contributed to our economy. And if we lessen the amount of insurance coverage from entitlements or private insurance, that will take us in the wrong direction. So there are many things at stake here.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. My name is Adrian Ordonez. I want to preface my question by saying that I'm by no means a Republican. I would not be caught dead with that party. This question is primarily for Ali and Linda. Can y'all, we've spoken a little bit, or y'all have spoken a little bit about violence in Central America and that being a driver of immigrants coming to America. But I almost never hear about the cause of that violence, which is primarily U.S. interventionism. Just for example, looking at Hillary Clinton's stint as Secretary of State, she intervened in Haiti, she intervened in Honduras, she intervened in Paraguay. Can you all speak to what kind of policy changes we need in regards to ending U.S. interventionism and what that could do to curb immigration, if that's really something that people want to stop happening in America?
So it's a small question. I mean, look, the United States has a really complicated and at times painful relationship with countries in the Northern Triangle. Last year I did a couple of trips to Honduras and spent a couple days in San Pedro and another couple days in Tegucigalpa. And I met an organization called the Association for a Just Society. It's a faith-based organization that's been there for 25 years. They've got staff across the country working on education, on violence prevention, a number of programs. So one of the most important things that they work on is anti-corruption. Because of foreign aid from the United States, they were able to work with the president of Honduras, the attorney general, leaders in the Catholic Church, the evangelical church community, and they put together a commission to purge the police force of corrupt individuals. And it wasn't from a bottom up, it was from the top down. And they ended up being a part of a process that eliminated, or purged, I should say, I want to say 5,000 people, 5,000 officers from a total national force of about 13 or 14,000. So now there's this infusion of young talent into the police force who care about the health, the vitality, and protection of Honduras. that in a large degree was, that, number one, was a result of local leadership, local incredibly courageous leadership. But it was also a function of the U.S. saying, we're going to put our resources on the table to address a root cause. So yes, I'm not going to dispute the past historical painful relationship, but I think we also have to realize that when this administration says to Honduras, we're going to pull your foreign aid, guess how much ASJ lost in support last year? $2 million. That forced them to lay off 40 people. That forced them to, scramble to find other resources. So, I think there's amazing work happening, and we need to be thinking about complicated solutions to a complicated problem. But that means that we've also got to test our own assumptions along the way.
You have a question here? On the left?
Yeah, you mentioned sanctuary cities. I wanted to know if El Paso is considered a sanctuary city, why or why not, and if that has anything to do with, I guess, being able to house immigrants, for example, by the sheriff's department or anything like that. But I really kind of want to know the reasons why.
I said earlier, I think the sanctuary cities first came up in Austin, at least, with force in 2011, as far as legislation that was proposed, because a former governor was, he was throwing his hat in the ring for president, so he wanted to crack down. And the language in 2011 was kind of like Arizona light. It was, local law enforcement should be able to ask people their status. Reading through the bill, you guys can go back. It was HB 12 in the House and SB 9 in the special session in the Senate. The word detainer is nowhere in the language, and so now the definition has sort of evolved into specifically giving cops, police officers, excuse me, more of a role in immigration inquiries, but also punishing municipalities that don't hand over information to Immigration and Customs Enforcement. When there's been so many changes within DHS, but it was Ron Vitiello, who I think was he was an interim CBP head. He was in San Antonio before he was forced out. And I asked him specifically, is there any city in Texas that you would consider a sanctuary city with respect to these definitions? He said, no, absolutely not. There was reports last week that some of these tactical units were going to be deployed to Houston for one, and I think that's just, I'm not exactly sure what the rationale is behind that, but I mean, you had some sheriffs that were accused of running sanctuary cities who were actually sued. Lupe Valdez, the former sheriff of Dallas County, who were sued by folks because they were alleging that she was detaining people. So there was a lot more enforcement. I don't know if anybody wants to chime in, but that's the way, legislatively at least, that sanctuary cities have been defined, and with respect to even the Trump administration, they could have changed their mind, but they don't say that by definition that there is one. I don't know if anybody has anything to add to that.
I think it's safe to say we are absolutely not a sanctuary city. El Paso is incredibly militarized. That presence is felt regardless of what your status is. Additionally, we do still have a sheriff that is honoring ICE detainers. So, I mean, just based on this more like legal criteria, we are not a sanctuary city.
Did you want to add?
No, I agree we're not a sanctuary city. I think I don't know if this is your question, but we have to be very careful that we don't have state and local officers enforcing immigration law. That is very important, and that's one of the things. I know the sheriff does not do that. You're right, they are detaining them, but they're not enforcing immigration law. When we start doing that, we've really crossed the line. I don't think it's good for this community.
And there is a lawsuit, a settlement that does not allow the sheriff to ask for status. So that is protective. I don't necessarily know what the stance of the police is. I will say what we're seeing is we are not seeing a level of internal enforcement, but it's also not unheard of.
Okay.
The real threat, though, is it's just the conversation. So just from a crime victim standpoint, they don't come forward just because of the conversation, right, the mood, the environment. And so one is that's certainly not good for our community, but just ask yourself, if the victim doesn't come to us for their public safety, for their justice, for some accountability, then who are they going to go to? And the alternative is not good for us.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi. My question is, what do you think needs to happen to cause a cultural shift in the way that we think about immigration here in America?
Another small question. Who wants to take that? I mean, just one part of it. I mean, we talked a lot about rhetoric and just kind of what that means. The district attorney just mentioned just the fact that somebody can just talk about a policy has this sort of gooey factor, but overall,
We've done a lot of work in this space, and we just recently did some research. And so let me take a quick step back. Our basic theory is that most Americans have 3 fears when it comes to immigration: culture, security, economy. Culturally, the question is, are immigrants and refugees, are they integrating or isolating? Are they threats or protectors? Are they givers or takers? So from an advocacy perspective, we always try to think about how are we answering those questions in a respectful and an authentic way and not dismissing those questions. What our research is showing is that the point of entry for someone to begin to change their mind on immigration is a cultural message, meaning a discussion about common values around faith, around American identity, around patriotism. It doesn't take something away from an immigrant or a person of color, but it says, okay, there's something that we connect on. That's the point of entry. Then to begin to move somebody from persuasion to mobilization so that they are sharing information, they're asking for more information, they're calling a member of Congress, that's when you have to start to address the questions around security and economy. And I think a lot of times as advocates, we have a tendency to either dismiss the questions altogether or answer them in a way that is almost kind of out of order, right? And we think that, okay, if we just talk about jobs or the economy, it'll all be fine, we'll convince people. In reality, people see this as a complicated issue, so I think we have to provide a complicated answer.
I also think local leadership, we're sitting here with Senator Rodriguez, who often, speaks out and truly supports immigrant communities. Our immigrant community, now the asylum seekers across the border, to be bold. I mean, we have to continue to be bold leaders in this space. I mean, I will say, is UTEP a sanctuary campus? We talked a lot in the previous panel about how accessible this education is. I'm a UTEP alum. But is it truly accessible if a person is scared to be on campus if Border Patrol is here, on their bikes as often as they are?
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Marianne Luther. I work in the Office of International Programs here at UTEP with the international students. I'm a transplant here. I'm from Michigan originally. Before this, I worked at an immigration law firm as a legal assistant, working with lots of different types of visas and immigration statuses. One of the things that I find when I'm dealing with clients at my previous job, students here, is that they are victims of misinformation about everything immigration. And what I have to remind them is that immigration is a very complicated field. It changes every day. My question is, for the refugees and those that are seeking asylum, what are their expectations when they're coming here into the U.S. or applying for asylum? Do they expect such a complicated system? Are they aware of all of the hoops that they have to jump through? And what have they been told along the way that they're going to expect here?
It's a great question.
Sometimes people don't even know what asylum is. They have decided that they're going to save their family's life. And when they get to the border, sometimes I'll ask them, what are you going to do in the United States? They don't ask them, did you flee? They said, why did you come to the United States? And as attorneys, once we hear their story, we wish they had said, I came to the United States to save my life, but they don't. With so much pride, el orgullo, they say things like, I came to work. But you sit down and you talk, because they say that out of pride. They say that to make sure that agent that they just turned themselves into knows them and can trust them and say, I'm here to contribute. I'm not here to take from you. But they don't even truly understand that the answer that they're looking for at that moment is tell them why you left your country. It's not very clear. It's actually incredibly unclear, which makes the asylum process so much more daunting. So by the time we're speaking to people, they're already in the detention centers at that point, it's a little too late. They don't know a lot about the process. And then now, we're in a whole different terrain now. Like I said, asylum has essentially been gutted. Now we're dealing with programs with all the acronyms in the world, HARP and PACER and ACA, and MPP, which essentially are all just border cruelty, keeping asylum seekers outside of the country, rushing their process, lack of access to counsel, and being rapidly deported. So it's even more daunting now, the process for asylum seekers.
If I could actually follow up to your great question and ask you, I mean, is it fair to say that, you know, the coyotes, the smugglers, they're the ones that are selling them a bill of goods? And this isn't a partisan argument. I mean, the Obama administration used to say the same thing. Like, no, you will not get a permiso if you come here. But so how much misinformation is occurring south of the river and not once they get here in the confusion?
So when I was in Honduras last year, I mean, it was clear that the people were getting their information of when to come, how to come from the coyotes. It's full stop. In fact, I think that as a country, we have pretty much outsourced our entirety of our asylum system to the cartels. They're the ones who are deciding whether or not somebody can actually get to the U.S. And then when they do get to the U.S., what do? We turn them back around and put them in the hands of the cartels.
Folks, Evan said it better than I can, but again, I just want to thank you all for being here, for taking time out of your day. We're about to wrap up, running out of time, but and as a native son of El Paso, thank you for all the support you guys have shown this community the last 6 months. It means a lot, and it means a lot to everyone here. So thank you. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon, and we'll see you again soon.